Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another episode of Rethinking Culture, the podcast that shines a spotlight on leaders of businesses that people love to work for. My name is Andreas Constantinou. I'm a micromanager turned servant leader who's developed a personal passion for workplace culture. At Rethinking Culture, we're on a mission to help 1 million companies create healthier, more fulfilling cultures at work. And our latest project, Culture Health Check, is an online service that lets you measure your culture so you can manage it. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Jim Harter. Jim is a chief scientist for Gallup's workplace management and well-being practices. He is the author or co-author of 5 books. The 3 most recent ones are the number 1 bestseller, It's the Manager, and then Well-Being at Work and Culture Shock. Jim is the primary researcher and author of the first large-scale study on engagement and productivity and lots of other things in the workplace, which includes a staggering 1.8 million employees in over 200 organizations. So he has lots of data and insights he shares with his audience. And he's authored or co-authored more than 1,000 research studies in applied psychology and well-being. And for fun, he used to jump out of airplanes, and he's done that 250 times. And he also lives in an island in Nebraska. With all of that, very welcome to the Rethink Culture podcast, Jim.
Thanks for having me, Andreas. Great to be with you today and everybody else.
So where do we start? What is your work at Gallup in a few words? And what led you? Where did you develop the passion for researching well-being and culture?
Well, my job in a nutshell is to work with our team, to lead our team in making discoveries that organizations can apply to make their organizations better. I've had a chance to work on a lot of different projects while I've been here at Gallup, approaching 39 years in November now. And what led me into this work was kind of by accident. I got feedback when I was younger, one from a teacher who told me I could write really well. I knew that I liked math. I guess it didn't really sink in, but I liked studying people. I had a grandpa who was a sheriff who he talked to me about the people that he arrested and stuff. And he said, there's always something in their past that led to this. So that kind of got me thinking about, there's a story behind everybody. And at Gallup, I've been able to kind of learn about those stories, but also my job has been to aggregate information so we can understand what works across the board. And so it's been really interesting just to see how things have evolved in workplaces. And I have a real passion for organizations and what organizations can do to make a difference in the world through their employees, both through their work and through how they help them develop better lives as well.
What's been a big aha moment in your research over the years that you fondly recall?
One of the biggest was back in the 90s when we were studying organizations. And this finding was actually reported in The Economist, where we found that even in really large, famous organizations, the variability in how people perceive their company and their work is nearly as great inside of an organization across teams as it is across teams and all organizations. So, in other words, you can go into any famous organization for the first time before they really put in the right interventions, and you see variance in how people perceive the culture, how engaged they are, and also that relates to their performance. So you see variance in turnover rates, see variance in productivity, in profitability, in customer service. And so that that discovery led us to develop some interventions, because if we're going to help organizations create change, we found we've really got to understand where the variance exists and where we can intervene. It isn't always about managers from on high saying we're going to do this and everybody just suddenly follows. They've got to appeal to the networks within the organization and find those sweet spots. So then you kind of peel that back, and we found that the biggest causal influence on that variance was the variance in how managers lead their teams at a local level. So that discovery has kind of been the cornerstone of a lot of work that I've had a chance to get involved in, both in terms of building the right cultures in organizations, and then also helping organizations develop, employees of great lives, also on top of being highly productive, which I think both are important, and both can be done simultaneously if we get the right systems in place.
So I'm hearing that even the biggest brands, the organizations that people love to talk about, they have managers, and the managers can be either great or not so great. And it depends on how conscious, I guess, the manager is about their leadership style. And among other things, I'm oversimplifying perhaps. What are the qualities of a brilliant manager that people like to work for?
Well, there's kind of two sides to it. And they're both equally important. One are their natural traits. So we know that people are gifted with certain traits. Anybody who's had multiple kids or have nieces and nephews or have seen kids grow up, they know that they come out different, and they just have different personalities and different approaches. And so the first thing is we need to understand what the traits are of the manager, so that we can, on one side, select the right people to be managers. And we found that there are some common traits in great managers. And the other side of it is we've got to develop their strengths and help them become better managers based on the principles we've seen in our research that lead to highly engaged, productive teams. So half of it is who the person is, from a fundamental standpoint, what their traits are, and then the other half is the change that can happen once they get some insights into how and have those talents directed at the right performance management elements. And we can dig into this a little bit more, but the trait part of it, what great managers have, really boils down to 5 different areas. It's really how they motivate the people. The best ones are really good motivators. They're really good at influencing people to make. Sometimes they have to make tough decisions, but they're good at influencing people by helping to convince them why. They are excellent, exceptional at relating to others. Some of them are naturally just really good at it. By the way, we can give shortcuts for people that don't have these traits too to be more successful, but some of them just naturally have these. They have a thought process component to them.
Is traits like nurture or nature?
More like nature.
Is it teachable?
Traits are
traits
more
teachable.
Traits are more the way that I'm referring to them are more nature than nurture. The other half of it I was talking about is nurture, and that's how you take what the individual has and you help build on top of their strengths and direct them in the right way so that they can achieve greatness in their role. So even people who are maybe mediocre on some of these traits I just listed off, they can get better if we give them some insights on what their strengths are, and also help them understand what science has said leads to high levels of engagement, leads to really good goal setting, the right kinds of ongoing conversations with employees, and accountability. And so we found through our research, and we've tested this and done meta-analysis of it, that there is curriculum we can put inside organizations that helps managers become better and better managers, because we can simplify their job into not just an administrative job, but a coaching type job where they get better at coaching the people around them. Some people will never fit into the role of manager. They they might think they need to be in that role because it's what everybody else has aspired to do, or because there seems to be more status, or in many cases there's pay associated with being a manager. There's some command and control elements that appeal to people sometimes, but a lot of times people get into the role and they find out that it's people are different, they're messy, and it's an uphill climb. Other people get into the role and they get inspired by all the differences that they see on their teams. So part of it is finding the people that have a real passion for managing others, and the other part of it is giving them the right curriculum and the right ongoing teaching so that they can keep getting better and better. And both of those are solvable.
And what are the skills you teach, or what are the skills that you find have a correlation or causation with engagement?
Yeah, the skills really are about kind of pulling together. So just to back up a little bit, most organizations have programs inside their organizations that seem disparate. Like you've got a performance management program over here, you've got an employee engagement survey over here, you might have a wellness program in another bucket. What the best teaching we think that happens is when you pull those things together into a more simplified model that includes one, helping employees continually set goals that inspire them. And in many cases, that involves involving them in setting those goals. When people feel some ownership for the goals, they're more likely to really go after them with some passion. And most employees will set higher goals than what the manager would have even set for them. The second is having the right kinds of ongoing conversations with employees. And if I was going to put that in a nutshell, I'd say at least one meaningful conversation every week. And I can kind of break down what goes into that. We've asked employees what inspires them in terms of the kinds of conversations that the right managers have with them. But one meaningful conversation a week at least. And then they have to have some level of accountability. If you think about all the work, how work has changed lately, all the hybrid work, remote work, we can give people all the autonomy in the world, but there has to be accountability. Managers need to have a way to hold people accountable so that it's not just for the organization, it's also for the individuals. They know when they shine. They get feedback and know when they're doing the best work, their best work. And if you have accountability that's focused on the individual's contribution, how they collaborate with their team effectively, and the value they bring to customers, those three, and I'd say you can simplify it to those three. Almost any outcome that you measure for an individual, you could put into one of those three categories: individual performance, team collaboration, customer value. And a lot of times when organizations are trying to change and adapt to this new world, they think first about, let's decide whether people should be working remote or not. Well, you got to kind of put that through a funnel of first, what works for the individual. That's of course important, but also what works for the organization, and that can depend a lot on the person's age. It can depend on some of the person's natural tendencies in terms of how they work. But we found that making those kinds of decisions, only 14% of the time people will make those decisions by talking it over with their team in terms of what works best. Most of those decisions about where people are working now happen because leadership said we're going to do this, supervisor said we're going to do this, or the individual just decides on their own, and it's kind of a free-for-all. Those systems don't work as well as if you work through the team, so that when people do show up, they're there together, and all the natural kind of conversations that need to happen. So I'm kind of going on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think there's been changes in how managers need to manage, and I think we have to simplify their jobs so that it's less administrative and more coaching, because a lot of it's happening from a distance now. And when people are physically distant, they'll tend to be more mentally distant. And that aligns with some patterns we're seeing in the data, where people are starting to feel less connected to their organizations and looking for other.
Was there something you were hoping that managers will learn from COVID and they didn't?
Well, I think the big learning was that people have some work they can do independently, have some autonomy that they didn't realize they could have before. They could do some work where they avoid the commute. The number one reason people didn't want to come back to the office was the commute. But the big learning on top of that, so that's sort of some of the obvious stuff that everybody kind of realized on their own if they did have the chance to have a remote job. But what on top of that, what we can't forget about, and what not all managers and leaders are some of them are starting to pick up on it, is that in-person time does matter when you can make it happen. It's not necessarily the total amount of time as it is. It needs to happen. There needs to be a plan around how it happens, so that when I show up, I know who else is going to be showing up. There are things that happen in an office setting or at a workplace, at any workplace, that you can't predict. You might be able to solve a problem in 10 minutes when you may have never even brought up the problem, and you might have had to schedule a meeting for it, and maybe nobody schedules the meeting, and things just kind of keep going on and on. You have creative conversations that can happen. Part of human nature that we can't, in this new world of work with these boxes that we're in on our laptops, it doesn't totally replicate what happens in person. And so we've got to be very planful about and purposeful about when people are together, and also give people the autonomy. I actually think we could build the best workplaces ever as a result of what we learned from COVID, if we make sure that we balance that need for autonomy with what the organization needs to get done, and never forget about the fact that what leaders really care about are customers, because they bring in the money if it's a for-profit business or even a private business. Whoever that customer is, whether it's a member or a customer or whoever it is that they serve, you can never forget about that. And when people start becoming mentally distant from their organization, they're less likely to do the extra discretionary things that really impact customers. They're more likely to say somebody else will do that, or it's not my job, I'm going to do the minimum required. We heard this back in, I guess it was around 21 or 22, with this term called quiet quitting. They kind of caught on internationally, went kind of viral. That's very similar to a concept that we've called not engaged at work, where people just show up, do the minimum required. And Andreas, I would say that there aren't too many jobs anymore where you can just do the minimum required tasks. Most leaders expect people to do to serve coworkers when they need their help, to serve customers when they randomly make a request. We can't predict everything that we need to do in an organization to be successful ahead of time. So there has to be some response to the spontaneous things that happen as well. And that takes employees who are highly engaged, involved, enthusiastic, and really feel like they're a part of the organization. We can do that from a distance in this hybrid world now. We can do it if it's fully on site as well. Some of the same principles apply, but we can't forget about the role of human nature in the workplace if we're going to get this right going forward.
So a fully remote company can have a great culture, as can a fully on-site company, is what I'm hearing. But it really depends on making sure that both the company and the employee can be accountable to each other and not just autonomous.
I think they can. I think there's at this point in time, there's an uphill battle for people who can work remote but are required to be on site 5 days a week. That's a group that's having some problems right now. And there's also an uphill battle when people are fully remote because of that in-person element. But if you have great managers, you can, to your point, you can accommodate that and you can make it work. But there's challenges on both sides. And in a hybrid world where you're working on site some, and at home some, there's a coordination component. So there are challenges no matter what category someone's in terms of where they're working from. But if you have great managers who are in touch with people and have at least one meaningful conversation a week, that's much more important than where they're working, like 4 times more important than whether they're on site or not. So I think that being planful about whether people are on site is important, but leaders have to start with what kind of culture do we want to build and why, and employees need to know why. If you say, we're going to be on site 3 days a week, here's the 3 days, they want to know why. And you have to articulate, what value that brings to the company, whether that's the value to the customers, whether that's a value in terms of a culture that you want to intentionally build where people get to know one another. A big one is younger people. If younger people start fully remote, they're going to have an uphill climb in terms of developing. Not that it can't happen from a distance, but it's going to be, and young people need development. They need mentors. And so they'll keep flipping jobs if they don't see that development. They don't see their future in the organization. And so making sure that young people get some of those in-person interactions, I think, is really important. Again, it can happen from a distance, but it's a much more of an uphill climb.
We talked earlier about the us versus them mentality for managers. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, we sometimes see these patterns in the data where you've got teams that are highly engaged, but they don't feel real connected to the rest of the organization. They may not feel connected to the mission or purpose of the organization, or they may say, I'm not fully satisfied with the organization, but I'm engaged in my work. That's an example of a manager who may be getting the local needs met for the employee, but they're making excuses because they don't want to look bad, and so they'll point to somebody else. That's more of a siloed kind of mentality. And we're seeing a pattern in the data now. So that's at the manager level. But from an employee's perspective, when you're at a distance from the employer, when you're mentally at a distance from the employer, you're more likely to think of it as a me versus them, or us versus them mentality. And the best run organizations have people who are in it together. And it starts with getting basic needs met. A lot of people don't know this, but things as simple as knowing what's expected of you at work, having what you need to do your work, having an opportunity to do what you do best and use your strengths. And when you do good work, do you get recognized for it? Do you have somebody that you feel really cares about you and is developing you for the future? Those are foundations that if you get those wrong, it can quickly become an us versus them mentality. If people feel confused about their role, and we've seen those elements actually drop as time has gone on. Employee engagement reached a peak right before COVID hit, and then it started dropping the latter half of 2021, and that was associated with the so-called Great Resignation. And what causes us versus them usually boils down to those fundamentals that I listed off there about role clarity. Do I feel like I'm rewarded when I do good work? Does my manager even know what work I'm working on, and so that he or she can give me feedback on it? So those meaningful conversations once a week are really important, and that's the simplest recommendation I could give anybody, was to make sure you have a habit of touching base with every person, no matter where they're at least once a week. And if you have too many people when you can't do that, you might have an issue where span of control is a problem. But it doesn't have to take too long. It could be 15 to 30 minutes. But when we ask people when they have a meaningful conversation, what happens, they tell us, well, my manager gave me recognition for something I did. Maybe they heard it from a coworker and they convey that to the person. They help me set goals and priorities because things change in organizations all the time. They help me think about who I collaborate best with and how collaboration can work best inside the organization. They focus on my strengths. They get to know my strengths and give me feedback on my strengths, tell me to think about how I can, use my strengths more effectively in my current role. So, those are the kinds of things that happen in meaningful conversations that oftentimes get overlooked, and we just kind of let people go, assume that they're going to do their work. But another insight, Andreas, that we learned along the way that really surprised me, this is one of my big surprises, was we asked people what their preference was, whether they wanted their work and life to be blended or whether they wanted their work and life to be more separated. And I was surprised that when you look across the population, you had an even 50-50 split of whether people wanted their work and life to be separated versus blended. You think in this new, hybrid world, people just expect that it's going to be blended, but there are people who want it to be more separated. And the other thing, this was the surprising part, the most surprising part, both groups were equally as likely to be engaged in their work. So the key is managers have to know what the person's style is, and you can't know that without asking them. It's kind of like only 10% of people tell us that someone asked them how they like to be recognized. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit for managers and leaders in this space, in this culture space, and one of them is, the people that are in the best position to help you build a solid culture are the people closest to the action, and those are your managers. But if your managers don't know, and if their fellow teammates don't know, if someone's we call them a blender or a splitter in terms of how they think about their work life. If they don't know if they're a blender or a splitter, they could easily disrespect the person. And I think coworkers need to know that as well. So there might be somebody who is working, at night and can't figure out why somebody else won't respond to them when they're working on an urgent project. And there's somebody else who might be working during regular hours during the day, and they can't figure out where somebody else is and why other people aren't there. But if they know, then they can accommodate for that. It's not always going to work perfectly, but
very interesting.
But yeah, I thought it was really interesting that, and you look across even generations, and there's some tendencies that lean one way or the other, but there's a huge variance even across age groups in terms of whether people prefer work and life to be separated or blended, and some of that has to do with life situation as well.
So, which reminds me, in many companies we avoid sending emails late in the day because we assume everyone's working 9 to 5, and we don't want to disrespect those that are in their family time. But then you're saying that give or take 50% of the population actually enjoys or appreciates working off their daily schedule or odd hours, and they don't see this as a violation of their personal time.
Right. Yeah, and the key is that people know that about one another. So I've got a coworker that works different hours than me, and when she came into my work life, I think I improved my productivity maybe 10 times when I was interviewing her for the job, and because I used to crank out my own data and run my own analyses, and I said, "What do you want to do?" And she said, I want to be between you and the data." I said, "Okay, I got to think about that." And I found out she was so proficient at working with data files and running analyses, but we have different work schedules. So we've been working together long enough that I know that she works late hours. I'm more of a blender too, but I get up really early in the morning. And so what she does is she'll be working on something. I show up in the morning and I've got a Christmas present waiting for me. I've got a present, what I consider a present, which is new data, new analyses. Right. And so knowing that about each other makes our work very fluid. And it's just knowing what to expect of the other person.
And this can only be done one-to-one, not as a blanket policy, is what I'm hearing. What is a leadership mistake you see managers making again and again that most managers have a blind spot on?
I think we've got a long ways to go on this still, but it's that everybody develops in the same way, that we can give people a developmental cookie cutter approach, and that they'll all be able to follow that and develop at the same pace. A big insight that we've learned along the way is that everybody's different based on their strengths, and that we need to be able to, if we have curriculum, it needs to be, and if we help managers think about development the right way, they have to start with who the person is first and what their natural tendencies are first, and then make that fit into the expectations of the role. So you could have two people that achieve the same outcomes in somewhat different ways, and they might even work together and complement each other in different ways if they know each other's strengths. So one person might be highly focused, another person may not be quite as. I actually have this is an example of somebody that I work with, one of my best friends at work. I've got high focus. He doesn't. We live in different cities, but he has incredible ideation, incredible analytics. And so what I bring into it more is, with the research mind, is I bring kind of focus to the work that we need to get done and what's going to benefit organizations the most. And he'll go deep, and you could ask him almost any question. He knows something about it. It's like he's got all this stuff in his brain. And my brain's more kind of, I build up a lot of knowledge around very specific areas. But knowing those differences, we can complement one another and work together and get a lot done. So
Do you believe people's strengths change over time?
I think it would be naive to say that they don't. But they tend to be, as we get older, they tend to be more stable than change. And we do test, retest, reliability studies we have a tool called Clifton Strengths. I know you're very fond of it.
Yeah, it's my favorite personality tool.
It has a test, retest reliability of 0.7, and that holds it pretty well over years. So it means what it means. Your rank, it measures 34 strengths, and your rank ordering of those strengths will stay pretty much the same. I've seen some people who have told me that they took it multiple times and their strengths did change, and it was in response to the strengths that they needed to rely on for a very different type of job that they were in. So there's exceptions. And I think we always have to know that, the strengths that we leverage might change over time, but the ones that are toward the top, once we become adults, tend to stay toward the top, and the ones that are at the bottom tend to stay toward the bottom. And, but, there's always exceptions to that. People could have, very massive changing life experiences where they tap into something very different than they ever had before. So I think it's a continuous learning process for everybody in terms of how they develop and what they leverage. But when we talk about strengths, we're talking about you kind of think about it a different way. We always want to build strengths, but we start with the traits that are more stable, and we use those traits to impact the things that are more changeable. So we understand what's less changeable and use that to impact what's most changeable. And what's most changeable is the kind of culture that we want to build, like engagement and helping people build competencies over time. And those are all changeable kinds of things, competencies, skills. But we have to start first. So that's part of the mistake, is to not start with what's less changeable and figure out how to apply that in a way that makes the culture changeable.
What's an example?
Well, we see it with employee engagement all the time, where when people know their basic strengths, they can be much more efficient at clarifying expectations, at recognizing people in the right way, at having good progress discussions with them, that developing them. I've talked a little bit about development, but I can develop you, Andreas, if I know your strengths, I can develop you in a different way that I might develop somebody else, because I'm leveraging what you're naturally good at and building competencies around that are aligned with what the organization is trying to get done.
Right. Yeah, I get it. You mentioned earlier about Gallup study of engagement, and if I remember correctly, it's at a lower point than it was 2 or 3 years ago before the pandemic, but it's also stayed at that low point. Have you thought about what is unfolding over the next 10 years? What's a wild guess about how the world of wellness at the workplace is unfolding?
Well, there's a big concern right now, for the right reasons, around mental health, and so that's starting to enter into the workplace a little bit more. Not that we expect any manager to become a mental health expert, but what we found is that if you get the culture right, and what organizations can improve on, that improves overall well-being, is the culture that they put in place. And that starts with those foundational engagement elements. When people, the first thing they want when they come to work is they want a job where they can be successful, and they want to know what their role is. And too often people go into, we're going to try to fix this mental health problem that we see out there in society, without starting with the foundation, which is the career component. And that's what we spend most of our time doing, outside of sleeping. If we're living the right kind of life and we get enough sleep, outside of sleeping, work is the thing that we do the most in our working lives, and that's most of our lives. So we've got to get that foundational career component right first if we're going to build um, build a workplace with high levels of well-being. It doesn't mean that sometimes we have to give people the resources like an employee assistance program resources. Those should always be available. But managers through work can impact well-being tremendously. And when I look into the future and I see where I think where engagement can be, I look at organizations that are doing it right now, and we recognize those organizations every year. But so the global average is 23% engaged right now. In the U.S., it's 32%. The best practice organizations globally are at 70% on average. So they've more than doubled the U.S. average, more than tripled the global average, and that did not happen by accident. And so what I've really been interested in learning about over the years, decades, is to study success. And it's always out there to study, right? You could look at the averages all day, but you got to find success and study what successful organizations are doing differently, and then teach other organizations how to do that. So I think the reason we saw engagement grow for a decade, and now we're meeting some new challenges, as you mentioned, but there's a way out of that. But the reason we saw it grow for a decade was because more and more organizations were applying those kinds of principles. They're developing and what great organizations have done effectively to do that is that, number one, they've made engagement not just a survey they do every year, but it's a part of their strategy. They help people know why it's a part of their strategy that we're building. We're using this concept of engagement, which comes down to those fundamentals I talked about: role clarity and making sure people are rewarded appropriately, developing them appropriately, helping them see how they're connected to the mission or purpose of the organization. If they get that part right, then it opens the door for everything else. But the best practice organizations they make sure that engagement is a part of their strategy, which means employees need to know why it exists all year round, not just during the survey part of it. Second, they've got great communication internally so that people know what's happening and why, and that flows through their managers. Third, they have a really good intentional process for developing their managers into highly effective managers as coaches. And then fourth, they've got really strong accountability, so that managers know part of my job, a really important part of my job, is engaging my team. And if I lead a team that continuously over time is disengaged, I'm ruining their lives. And leaders know that. When leaders are making it a part of their strategy, they make it clear that part of your job as a manager is to inspire lives, not destroy lives. And to inspire lives, you've got to pay attention to all those things we've been talking about. So these best practice organizations do that really well. And in many cases, they do it their own way, but they generally tend to fit into those four categories I listed: strategy, communication, manager development, and accountability.
On a personal side, is there something you had to rethink recently to challenge yourself on a belief or assumption?
On a personal side, outside of work?
No. Within, I mean, it could be within work, but is there a finding that you had to overturn, for example?
I think the biggest challenge has been this transition through. So I think the workplace has changed more than it ever has in my lifetime because of the pandemic. So we had to rethink the role of manager, and how can the role of manager be more efficient? That's a lot of the findings that we included in our latest book, Culture Shock, are that. So is really, we had to dig in deep to our data to really understand, how is this role of manager a little different than it's been before, and how do we because on one side you've got leaders who are saying, people, after the pandemic and what you learned, just do what you need to do to get your work done. Everybody can do their own thing. there's another side that said, we need people back in the offices. We've got this real estate space. We've got to use it. And we really believe we know that people are working when we can see them working on site. So the challenge has been understanding what the data are really saying about those things and where you find the right, I guess I'll call it balance, but it's really the right expectations for an organization, which has to start. So the challenge is you have to start with leaders and what kind of culture they want to build. And they have to be very concrete about, here's the culture we want to build and why. And then how do you make that work for each organization in their own unique way? I work with one organization that has everybody in one of their divisions, they have everybody in the office every day. Another part of the organization has very high level of hybrid work. And they're doing similar kinds of things, but they've got somewhat different cultures inside the same organization, but they've been able to make it work because their employees are bought into it. I've got a brother-in-law who runs a manufacturing plant that he worked with his team to figure out that, one of the best things he ever did was move to a 4-day work week because it worked for the team, it worked for the customers. So he had to channel that through not only the team, but also the impact on the customers. So if you got buy-in from the team and the customers and they could save on overhead, then that worked. I know that concept of 4-day work week has been out, and I've had a lot of questions about it over the years. I don't think it works for everybody. I don't think it's realistic for everybody, but for some it is, particularly on-site workers, it could be. So that's the other challenge is how do you make this work for people who have to be on site versus those who don't have to be on site? And I think what my learning in that was that you've got to build some element of flexibility and autonomy, whatever that means to the people in those situations, and still have accountability with it.
If you could whisper to the ear of a leader who's not intentional about the culture they're building, what would you say to them?
I would start with, in the simplest way possible, what is the purpose of your organization? Can you describe that in one sentence? And then what cultural attributes do you think, based on your experience, will lead to you achieving that purpose? If you lead with on-site versus not on-site as your starting point, then I don't think it's going to work because you've got to lead with your purpose, who you're serving, and it's got to be simple enough that every employee can remember it. There's a lot of great mission statements on corporate walls that nobody ever remembers, but I would say think with your executive team and interview your employees about what the organization is really about and who you're serving, and then use that as your North Star in terms of how you develop your culture so that you meet those needs. And it can happen a variety of different ways, but people have to be bought into it and they need to know why. And you can never really get the why part right if it's not connected to the purpose of your organization and who you're serving.
And any parting words for the audience, or any book or anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I'm very optimistic, and I'm kind of inspired about where we can be in the future. I think we've learned a lot in the past several years about autonomy. I think we've also learned a lot in the past several years around how people can develop in this new environment and can have inspiring jobs, and what the role of manager and leader is and all that. So I'm optimistic about where we can be. I think if we do things right and we combine autonomy with great managing, great leadership, that we could have the best workplaces ever. And we've got examples of that right now in organizations that are doing it right. So it's all achievable. We've seen a lot of organizations grow significantly over time if they put the right practices in place. I think it can happen it doesn't have to be an overly complex solution. It can be, but we can't have all these disparate programs that confuse people. We've got to pull it together so that performance management and engagement are in the same, kind of going down the same path. but we made some discoveries around that, and I'm inspired by what organizations can be in the future.
And where can people find out more about you, Jim?
Well, you can find we publish all the time on Gallup.com. All of our latest discoveries are on Gallup.com. I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to connect with me there. I post some of our biggest studies on LinkedIn as well. But Gallup.com has an ongoing stream of management and leadership studies, in addition to all the other societal studies that we conduct.
Jim, thank you for your humility and your passion for helping managers lead brighter, happier workplaces, and for all your contributions all those years in researching the topic. But I can really see the passion behind the numbers, if you like, which makes a difference.
Thank you for saying that, Andres. It's been great talking with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of Rethink Culture. If you enjoyed the show as much as I enjoyed creating it for you, you can leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And while you're here, while not subscribed to the channel so you never miss a future episode, it helps me, helps the show, and it helps everyone who wants to learn from culture visionaries like Jim. And the podcast appears every couple of weeks. So you can subscribe and keep in touch with future episodes. And we also have a YouTube channel if you want to watch us and not just listen. And finally, if you want to find out more about how you can measure your culture so you can manage it, you can go to rethinkculture.co. And like I like saying at the end of every podcast, keep on creating a happier, healthier workplace for you and especially for those around you. Take care.